Turning now to our main story this Thursday, as we take you live now to the scene of the train accident near Kroonstad in the Free State. Our reporter Sika Lelwe-Mdingi is covering that story for us. Sika, before we get to the Transport Minister's briefing, just a couple of things. I need to know the exact location of this crash, and you've obviously had an opportunity to look at the damage that has been wrought. What does it look like?
It's about a 15-minute drive, Jeremy, from Kroonstad, between Kroonstad and a town called Henneman. And it is quite, when they speak about a train wreck, Jeremy, this is exactly what they mean. It stretches from where I'm standing towards, for a good few meters leading this way. And you can see that it was a full train, over 730 passengers making their way from their holidays back to Johannesburg. And they say that it happened around 9 o'clock this morning when that truck literally didn't stop, Jeremy, and the train crashing into it. And of course, it's been a busy morning here. We've seen locals coming out, offering water, offering something to eat to these passengers who are quite distraught. Some of them actually some of them concerned about the accident, but at the same time trying to figure out how they're going to get to their final destination. But of course, 12 people confirmed dead as it stands. But as you heard for yourself there, that number is not final because they still need to lift those carriages. And of course, hopefully, there will not be any bodies that would be found underneath.
Siki, how many carriages have in fact derailed?
Well, from the looks of it, Jeremy, from what we've been seeing, because they've been trying to get the media not to go on this, to walk around the scene as much, but about 4 carriages have seen lying on their side. But as I'm saying, it's quite a long train as well. And of course, if you're going to have over 700 passengers, that means there were quite a number of carriages that this train was literally drawing. And of course, one of the things that we do understand, about 400 of them, over 400 of them now, they just left about 30 minutes ago in buses taking them to Johannesburg Park Station, where they'll be then, once they get there, they'll be met by some press officials. One of the things that PRASA is also trying to organize today, the minister didn't mention it, but they're also trying to organize trauma counseling for some of these passengers, because they described scenes of fear, screaming, Jeremy, especially at that point when this train caught fire and they were unsure whether they'll be able to get out. But the locals who are here as well, helping the police to drag some of the people out to places of safety as well. But of course, the police are still on the scene trying to ascertain exactly what happened. And of course, once that they get to the truck driver, of course, he also has quite a bit of explaining to do.
Let's talk about that fire, Sika Lelwe, if we can, and possibly my team can play some of the earlier video that we received of those carriages that were ablaze. How many carriages do we know were on fire, and was that fire brought under control fairly quickly?
Yes, definitely. That fire was brought under control fairly quickly. But then, of course, the fire department that was here, they were quite exhausted. It's a pity that my cameraman can't walk the scene, because some of them are still literally sitting on the road, catching their breath after everything that happened. About 3 or so carriages that caught fire. And of course, there were some people, reports are, but of course still not confirmed to us at ENCA, but some people on the scene saying that some of those deceased were burnt in that fire, saying that there might be a child who was burnt beyond recognition. But again, that is word on the scene. We are yet to confirm that detail. But firefighters here on the scene and a number of other different agencies that deal with emergency situations like this one, still trying to contain some of the situation. But it's going to be that tough job, Jeremy, of getting this train off the track. I'm going to step out so that you can actually see where it's lying. It's lying across the railway line, so they'll have to move it. And it is quite long, as I keep saying. So it's not an operation that's going to take a few hours. It's going to take some time. And this, of course, again, is the railway line that other trains that are supposed to be making their way to Johannesburg from the Eastern Cape and other parts of the country from that side will need to be using over the next couple of days. And of course, it's that busy time of the year, January, when people are making their way back home, as they say in this part of the world and in the Eastern Cape, people going back to work. And of course, so PRASA will be trying to ensure that this is cleared, but of course, definitely it won't be an easy operation.
Siki, we know the truck driver is in hospital. The Transport Minister, Joe Maswanganyi, saying that blood tests will be conducted to establish sobriety. He also said, the minister, that he was taking a chance when he crossed the level crossing. Do we know the extent of injuries sustained by the truck driver, and also the train driver himself, who would have been at the front end of this accident? What do we know of him or whoever was in that driver carriage?
A very important thing, Jeremy, about how these accidents happen. The acting CEO of Prasa Rail putting it quite clearly when I spoke to him earlier on, saying that trains don't just have stop signs. You know, it is up to the cars that want to cross the rail line to follow what the signs tell them. So once a truck, like what happened today, crosses that line, it's too late. A train can't just randomly stop. And in those cases like now, once a driver takes that chance, there's little a train driver can do. And of course he is injured, and now authorities trying to figure out what could have caused him to cross that line. Again, unconfirmed reports, but one of the things we heard when we got here was that he did try to make a run for it, Jeremy. He did try to run, but of course policemen were on the scene, and they did try and they did apprehend him. He is in hospital. Blood tests will be conducted, and of course, considering the scale of this accident, officials here saying that the law will have to take its course. We have not heard word yet, of course, with regards to the well-being of the train driver himself, as all those details we're still collecting while we're here at the scene.
So 268 injured, I think that is the figure that the minister mentioned. 4 of those critical. Of those injured, how bad are they injured, or are they essentially just walking wounded?
You know, Jeremy, as we were driving here, you could see the scale of this incident as we had ambulance after ambulance passing us. Actually, it's one of those times in the job as journalists, you don't want to imagine the kind of scene you'll get to. Quite a number of ambulances rushing, trying to get to the different hospitals, some going to Welkom, some going to Kroonstad, some being sent to Virginia. And some of those injuries, there are burnt injuries there as well, Jeremy, because of that fire. And of course, there are injuries maybe around people who were suffocating because that train was packed. And at the same time, some passengers saying that everyone was trying to find a way to escape. So some of those injuries could have been gotten during that process. Imagine it's a crash of 700 people in those different carriages of that train, and them trying to get out. So definitely the extent of those serious injuries, only one can imagine. But they've been sent to the different hospitals. Authorities and government officials will be visiting those different hospitals at the same time, also offering support to the different families who've lost their loved ones in such a tragic way this morning.
Of the 12 that died, and Siki, I don't know whether you've established this because you haven't been on the scene for too long. Do we know whether the 12 were sitting in one carriage or whether they were spread across the 4 carriages that derailed?
Unfortunately, we have not been able to establish those details, Jeremy, but what we do know, it's 12 confirmed, and with officials saying they're hoping they won't get more as they work through the wreckage of this train. But of course, the number of carriages, as I said, that have been burnt, it's not just one. I'll move out of shot again. It starts from here going all the way, and it's possible that definitely could not have been in one carriage. And when we rushed here, Jeremy, even with the injured, because they took them out of the train, but as they were trying to observe and get to understand what's happening, some were getting sick as it happened. As the cameraman and I literally parked the car, paramedics were rushing with a young child, maybe around the age 4 or 5, who was suffering from a heat stroke. So some of those injuries are secondary, not necessarily to have happened inside the train, but could have been caused by the events of the last couple of hours.
You make a very good point, Siki. Let's not forget it's a very, very hot day in the Free State. Again, I understand that you have not been on the scene for too long. I also understand that many of those passengers are now on buses on their way back to Park Station. At any point in the past half an hour or so, have you had an opportunity to engage with any of the passengers? If so, what have they told you?
One of the main things, Jeremy, they were quite exhausted. It had been a long day, for starters. the fact that this happened in the morning, and by the time we got here, it was maybe around 2:30, just around 2. They'd been here for hours. They had been waiting, and that waiting had taken its toll on them. But of course, secondly, one of the things that we realized, that there's a level of shock that people have died, Jeremy, the level of shock that people had died. And when the minister, the transport minister, went to inform them, informing the last bus about the number of fatalities, and you could see that when he said the number 12, and of course him explaining that those numbers could rise, the number could be higher, they were quite shocked by the extent of exactly what had happened, but at the same time shocked that they had survived what had happened. And different ones actually were just trying to get in touch with their families, trying to ensure that to make sure that they're well. And there were quite a number of children as well. So that's another area of concern. I did pose a question to the minister. Unfortunately, he didn't respond. But I tried to ask if there are any in the fatalities, if there are any children. But definitely in the numbers that have been sent to hospital, there would be children there, of course. And you could see quite a lot of mothers as well on that bus, on those passengers. And I think what I was saying earlier on, that they'd been tired. By the time those buses were pulling up, just before the minister spoke, when they're pulling out, they're literally waving, like feeling that, look, it's done, we're going to where we're supposed to go. And even the paramedics and people on the scene waving back at those buses and those passengers. I guess that feeling at times like this, that a little bit of a wound is being passed from one person to the next.
I did hear you putting that question about the child, Siki, to the minister. It'll be some time, I assume, before we receive identities of those who've been killed and injured.
Definitely, and of course that painful task for authorities, where they now also have to inform some of those families, and of course getting all the details, sitting down, Jeremy, with the number and the list of the passengers who boarded this train, the 730, are they all accounted for? Who is missing? Where could they be at this point in time? And of course, again, getting those families of those in hospitals, those tens and tens or dozens and dozens are in hospital, ensuring that their families are aware of exactly which hospitals they've been sent to, the extent of their injuries, and just the personal admin, Jeremy, for those passengers, some of them having to get in touch with their employers as they're returning back to work, and also trying to find other means once they get to Johannesburg of eventually making it to their home. I remember one of the passengers that we spoke to via hybrid at ENCA telling us that the train actually, she boarded yesterday, 24 hours ago, around 3 in Port Elizabeth. So of course that time as well, where they've just have to kind of process everything, but at the same time dealing with all those logistics in terms of what happened to them here this morning.
All right, Siki, you're doing a fine job for ENCA. We'll check in with you a little bit later. I urge you please to be safe and also to stay hydrated. Very hot temperatures in the Free State.